Today's video is sponsored by Blinkist. This amazing app summarizes some of the best learning books and podcasts into knowledge nuggets so you can easily get the most important information quickly, as well as offering the option to listen to them if you prefer listening to reading. You can easily digest all the main points of a book in about 20 minutes or less, which saves so much time and gives you exactly what you need to know. It has some of the best titles around, from every learning topic you can think of, from productivity and success to mindfulness and happiness. There is a huge variety to get stuck into. I personally am currently listening to Do Nothing by Celeste Headley. If you are stressed at work or life in general, I highly recommend it. So, what are you waiting for? This exclusive offer is for the first 100 people who click the link at the bottom of the description to enjoy 1 whole week of free, unlimited learning and 25% off membership if you choose to join. Today we are looking at a case from the late 19th century, so sit back as we go to England. Montague Druitt was born on the 15th of August 1857 in the small town of Wimborne in the beautiful English county of Dorset. He was one of 7 children born to Mr. William Druitt and his wife Anne. Montague's father was a very respected person in the local community, and as well as being a surgeon, he was also a justice of the peace and made sure that all of his children had a privileged upbringing. The family lived in a fine residence called Westfield House, which was one of the biggest houses in the area, and life for Montague and his 3 brothers and 3 sisters was very different to the majority of children growing up in Victorian Britain. Although he was very well educated, he was also a natural scholar, and when just 13 years old, was offered a scholarship at the very prestigious Winchester College, which was one of the most prominent schools in the country. He excelled at Winchester and was an outstanding student. He also took part in the debating societies. Many Victorian schools encouraged an active debating culture where pupils would debate various topics, and Montague always played an active role. He loved sport, and in his final years at Winchester was the opening bowler for the cricket team. When he graduated, he went to study at Oxford. Here he again excelled at sport, representing the university at both cricket and rugby. He graduated in 1880, aged 22. Young Montague had aspirations of becoming a barrister, but while he tried to enter the legal profession, he took a position as an assistant schoolmaster at a boarding school in Blackheath in southeast London. This was a good opportunity for him, as it came with accommodation, and Blackheath was only 7 miles and a short train journey from central London, where he would need to be while pursuing his legal career. In 1882, he was admitted to the Inner Temple, which was one of the 4 inns of courts responsible for training, regulating and selecting barristers within England and Wales. He managed to pay his membership fees with the financial assistance of his father and was called to the bar on the 29th of April 1885. He then set up a practice as a barrister. 5 months later, his father suddenly died from a heart attack. Although he was a very wealthy gentleman who left a substantial estate, Montague did not really benefit financially from his father's death, as Dr. William Druitt had already advanced his son money to help him start his legal career, and had deducted this from the inheritance that Montague would eventually receive. How well Montague did in his work as a lawyer is unclear. He rented legal chambers at 9 King's Bench Walk in the Inner Temple and seemed to live a comfortable life, but he also continued with his work at the school. In the late 19th century, not every barrister was able to make a good living, as many people were unable to afford legal counsel. Although prosecutors always used lawyers, defendants were often represented by travelling solicitors who visited different courts, charging a one-off fee for their services. This charge was not a significant amount of money, but it was more than many people could afford. Much of the legal work that Montague undertook in his practice was as a special pleader, which in Victorian Britain was a legally qualified person who specialised in drafting case statements. He enjoyed living in Blackheath. London was a polluted city, and the air in Blackheath was far more pleasant. People would stop in the street for a short conversation, and life seemed to go at a far slower pace. It was also a very popular place to play cricket, and Montague was able to play regularly throughout the summer months. His reputation as a bowler grew, and over the next few years, he was involved in many matches and became a well-known and well-respected member of the local cricket community. To the outsider, young Montague Druitt may have seemed like a very fortunate gentleman. He was from an upper-class family, well-educated, a barrister and a schoolmaster, and a very accomplished sportsman. But Montague himself may not have agreed with this perception. His mother had suffered from depression and in July 1888 was institutionalised. His maternal grandmother was declared insane and eventually took her own life. His aunt and one of his sisters also suffered from depression and anxiety. Life for the poorer people in London was very different to the one enjoyed by the likes of Montague Druitt. During the 19th century, London had grown into the most populated city in the world, and due to its industrial base, people moved there from many other areas of Britain and Europe. Despite the far greater opportunities for employment, there was a shortage of affordable housing. People crowded into very small and unsanitary dwellings. Families would often live in just one room, and it was not uncommon for those who had their own property to offer rooms for rent to obtain additional income. The East End of London was particularly notorious for street crime, overcrowded houses, and poverty. Many industries were centred near the docks. Men worked long hours in poor conditions, and London had become a very polluted place. It was not until the 1891 Public Health Act was introduced that industrial businesses started to adopt methods to reduce smoke and pollution. In order to try and support themselves and their families, many women turned to prostitution. An official report in 1888 recorded 62 brothels and 1,200 prostitutes in Whitechapel alone, although the real number was probably significantly higher. On Friday the 31st of August 1888, a young lady who was known to work as a prostitute, named Mary Ann Nichols, was found dead in Bucks Row, a back street in Whitechapel. Her mutilated body was discovered in the early hours of the morning. Just over a week later, on the 8th of September, a lady named Annie Chapman was found dead. For some reason, the killer had removed her womb. The press started to dub the unknown assailant Jack the Ripper. He struck again, this time on the 30th of September 1888. The victim was a prostitute named Elizabeth Stride. Police believe that Jack was disturbed while he was attacking the victim, as an hour later, a fourth victim was found in Mitre Square, another prostitute named Catherine Eddowes. Her body had been mutilated. The story of the search for Jack the Ripper was reported daily in the newspapers and put fear into the residents of Whitechapel. There was a public outcry to catch the killer. Despite leads and arrests, no one had been charged, and the failure of the police to find the person responsible led to increased scrutiny from the press. The police believed that the person they were looking for was a wealthy, well-dressed gentleman with a medical knowledge who had a disregard for women. The story was the main topic of conversation, especially amongst the residents of London's East End. Newspapers reported on the investigation and wondered if Jack the Ripper would strike again. On the 9th of November, 1888, the badly mutilated body of Mary Jane Kelly was discovered in Miller's Court in Whitechapel. The police believed that she was the fifth victim of the now infamous Jack the Ripper, and the newspapers filled their pages with stories of the terrible crime. The investigation continued. Suspects were interviewed. Some were of more interest to the police than others, but the pressure mounted from the press to find the perpetrator, as no one had been charged with the 5 Whitechapel murders. On the 30th of November, Montague Druitt was dismissed from his position at the Blackheath Boys' School. It was not clear as to why he had exactly been dismissed, but there was much discussion amongst the pupils and the staff as to what he had done to warrant such an action. He had his law practice, so still had work that he could attend to. However, a few days later, he disappeared. Inquiries as to the whereabouts did not lead to anything, and it was noted that he had not been seen in chambers during the first week of December. Although it was winter and not the cricket season, Blackheath Cricket Club removed him from the position of treasurer and secretary, believing that he had gone abroad. On the 31st of December 1888, the body of a young gentleman was found floating in the River Thames near Chiswick in West London. There were stones in the pockets of the deceased, and after examination, it was estimated that the body had been in the water for about a month. It was also presumed that the stones were placed to keep the body submerged. The police found a return ticket to Hammersmith, dated the 1st of December, a silver watch, a cheque for £50, and some gold. The gentleman was identified to be 31-year-old Montague Druitt. There was much speculation as to why and how he had ended up dead and floating in the Thames. The police and the coroner believed that he had taken his own life. Apparently his state of mind at the time was not good, and there had been a history of mental illness in his family. If someone had wanted to do him harm, they would have undoubtedly have taken his money and his possessions. A note was found which read, "Since Friday, I felt I was going to be like mother, and the best thing for me was to die." The day he was dismissed from his position at Blackheath School was a Friday, so it was thought that the note was referring to Friday the 30th of November. Montague John Druitt was buried at Wimborne Cemetery on the 3rd of January 1889. Although the exact date of his death was unknown, it was recorded as the 4th of December 1888. Just over a year later, in February 1891, the Member for Parliament for West Dorset, Henry Richard Farquharson, who was well acquainted with the Druitt family, announced that Jack the Ripper was the son of a surgeon who committed suicide shortly after the last victim, Mary Jane Kelly, was murdered on the 9th of November 1888. The opinion gathered momentum, and the journalist George R. Sims mentioned in his book, The Mysteries of Modern London, that Jack the Ripper had drowned in the River Thames. Sir John Moylan, the Assistant Under-Secretary at the Home Office, also believed this to be true, and Sir Basil Thompson, who became Assistant Commissioner of the CID in 1913, said that Jack the Ripper escaped justice by drowning himself at the end of 1888. In a private handwritten memorandum dated the 23rd of February 1894, the Assistant Chief Constable, Sir Melville Magneton, stated that he considered Montague Druitt to be the main suspect in the case. He claimed to have unspecified private information that left little doubt Druitt's own family believed him to have been Jack the Ripper. Witnesses who claimed to have seen the elusive Jack describe a well-dressed gentleman, about 30 years old and with a moustache, which all match Montague Druitt. However, Montague was slender, and witnesses described the man they saw as medium to heavy build. Those who support the theory that Montague Druitt was Jack point to the fact that his chamber at 9 King's Bench Walk was only a short distance from the East End, and could easily have been where he went after committing his terrible crimes, especially as trains did not run in the early hours of the morning between London and Blackheath. Montague, however, was not familiar with the East End of London, especially not the Whitechapel area. There was also his cricketing schedule. He played cricket in Canford in Dorset the day after the murder of Mary Ann Nichols, which was over 100 miles from London. He also played cricket in Blackheath the day following the death of Annie Chapman. Frederick George Aberline, who was the lead detective in the investigation, always denied that Scotland Yard knew the identity of Jack the Ripper and dismiss reports that he was a surgeon's son, who drowned shortly after the body of the fifth victim, Mary Jane Kelly, was found. Many people who lived in Whitechapel in the late 19th century believed that Alice Mackenzie, who was murdered on the 17th of July 1889, was also a victim of Jack the Ripper. While this is disputed by many, including the investigating officers at the time, if she was indeed a victim, her murder was committed 7 months after Montague Druitt's death, which would mean that he could not be considered a Jack the Ripper suspect. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. It would be really interesting to know your thoughts as to whether you think Montague Druitt may have been Jack the Ripper. I hope that you're all okay and staying safe, and I'll be back next week for another brief case